morning, everyone. It is nice to see you all again, those of you I know. It's always nice to see new faces when I've been gone for a year, too. I have to say that I looked forward to it with some mixed emotions. As I was reading today's lectionary, I was thinking, what did you get yourself in for? I looked at that list that Jesus says in Mark's gospel, and the first thought I was like, oh, why do you got to go there? Like, why does he have to start off with sex? If you start off a list with fornication, where can it go from there, right? Just everything else falls off the radar once you get done with that. And it made me want to ignore the entire list. It did not sound like a list coming from the progressive Jesus that I know and love, right? Yeah. I saw a website that was kind of similar. I was looking up things, and it was a website about what defiles a marriage. And I loved it when I started because it was like, oh, when you don't take care of others, that will defile your marriage. And when you don't welcome others into your home, that will defile your marriage. But then when it got down to the nitty-gritty, all he really cared about was sex. All he particularly cared about was sex acts between particular people. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? So I thought, well, maybe I need to just follow my wandering brain, like where might it take me? So I wondered about the meaning of the word defiled. And I read that the Hebrew word for defiled means spotty or dirty, and that makes perfect sense if you think about leprosy being kind of a spot on your skin. It was defiling. So that made a lot of sense to me. And then the Greek, and I loved this because there were so many synonyms for what defiled might mean. Draggled, bedraggled, begrimed, grubby, fly-blown, snot-nosed, travel-stained, squalid, raunchy, sordid, lousy, unswept, impure, and tarnished. And then a word I admit to having not known, or if I ever learned it, I didn't remember, Augean, A-U-G-E-A-N, extremely filthy from long neglect. Isn't that beautiful? I'm going to use the word again sometime. And then maculate. I didn't realize there was another version of immaculate, maculate, the opposite of it, blotched, blemished, stained, and impure, and my personal favorite, feculent, filthy with waste matter. And I thought, oh, they didn't wash their hands before eating. I bet there was some waste matter on them. They all fit those disciples who hadn't washed their hands before they ate. That regular washing that's so common for us, how many times we stick our hands under the faucet so often in a day, our skin gets all dried out. It wasn't common for them, right? So washing your hands before you ate was really important. You know, if you didn't, you were going to put some things inside you that were going to defile you, perhaps. Jesus was talking not about a medical process of bacteria and germs and how you could get defiled by getting diseases and sick. He was talking about something completely other than that. But he clearly was talking about hypocrisy in the crowd, wasn't he? Because he says to them, you are so worried about traditions. You are so worried about rituals. You are so worried about laws and rules and all that other stuff. But look inside your human heart for a minute. Just stop and look inside. That's where the evil intentions come from. And then he listed a bunch of evil intentions. But he also listed some actions that go along with those intentions. Like licentiousness. It's way down on the list, but it's probably what gives birth to the fornication and adultery that come at other places, right? And I thought, you know, this isn't pleasant sex that he's talking about. This isn't the good stuff, right? He's talking about something completely different. Women in his time were property. And when men had licentious thoughts about having sex with someone else's property, it came up with pretty awful consequences for the women involved. I read an article the other day called Divorcing Baal, the Sex of Ownership. And Bonna Devorah Haberman says that the biblical images of women are flat, like cardboard cutouts. And I thought, but that's just how men wrote them, right? She says, no, it may be deeper than that. It may be that what women lived with, they were suffering from abuse accommodation syndrome. That they were that flat because they were allowed so little opportunity in their lives. And she called it the result of patriarchal terrorism. The threats of physical violence, economic subordination, isolation, and other control tactics that made women's situations almost unbearable in biblical times. And the only way out was through divorce or widowhood, which left women in even a worse position than they were when they were married. I made myself a note here to tell you that I'm teaching a class starting Thursday on morality and sexuality, so I'm about up to here on sexual problems in Western religions right now. But Jesus' list also included envy and avarice, and that could bring about theft, right? Theft is a reasonable response and action that goes with that. And wickedness, pride, folly, all of that could cause the slander and deceit that he mentions, or the murder. And then I wondered, was he listing what he knew people were doing? Was he looking out in that crowd and saying, I know where the slanderer is. I know where the thief is. I know where the murderer is. Was he calling out people who were right there in front of him? In Matthew's version of the story, Jesus had already told his disciples that being angry with someone makes you liable for the same judgment that murdering them would cause. Insulting somebody, calling them a fool, these other things, that they are equally liable for judgment. I thought, wow. Is he saying in this list that all these intentions and the actions that follow them are all equal to murder? I mean, he was the master of overstatement, right? Hyperbole came naturally to Jesus, but this is wow. And yet I was still left wondering, what's the point of this list? James, where we read our morning meditation today, on the cover of the bulletin, James is a little easier to wrap our brains around, isn't he? You know, other parts of that section say be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, be doers of the word, not just hearers, bridle your tongues. James was a lot less focused on intention, on emotions, and a lot more focused on language. The language that we speak is what leads to the evil that we do. And that was where defilement came from for James. James is also quite clear what keeps us from being defiled. That verse on the bulletin cover. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress. Very simple. And it reminded me of one more definition I read, which was the definition of our English word defile that comes from the Old French. And that means trampled down. Widows and orphans were trampled down people in their time. They were without male protection in a world that wasn't friendly to women and children. And suddenly I wondered, what if I took James' definition and I went back to Jesus' list in Mark? Could I use that definition as a framework for looking at Jesus' list and find something that might be of value to us? How might James' care of widows and orphans create a lens to look at intentions and actions? Like the intention of licentiousness and the resulting actions from that. Looked at through James' lens, is that about the sexual abuse and sexual harassment of Jesus' day with these women, these widows and orphans, these children? Well, of course it was. Yeah, clear as a bell to me once I looked at it that way. And envy, avarice, theft, was that a source of poverty in Jesus' day? Well, of course it was. I mean, all of us, most of us here have some biblical something hidden back in our head. We could come up with all those verses, right? where somebody stole something from someone else, where the tax collector stole excessive taxes from the poor, where Rome stole property, where soldiers stole possession. We can see it. It was what happened in those days that trampled down the weak and the powerless. What about pride and folly and slander and deceit? Were they the wickedness that the powerful used to trample down the powerless? Of course they were. They always were, right? They still are, aren't they? Yeah. When the powerful deceive us, when they play on our pride and our foolishness, when they fill us up with slander, they tear us apart and they trample us down and they defile us. And when we do it to somebody else, we defile them too. I have to wonder what Jesus' list would look like in our time, right? What would he see in our hearts? What kind of attentions would he find there? And what kind of folly do we live with that he would see through in a second in us? And how would he challenge us to change our hearts, change our intentions, our language and our lives so that we can be the undefiled community that cares for the widows and orphans, cares for those who cannot care for themselves, that lifts people up instead of trampling them down, the community that Judson in its history has always striven to be. That poem that Mary Nell read earlier about communion, it's about a bread so light that it almost dissolves in air, a taste of wine or juice that hits the palate and is almost a memory as soon as it's swallowed. And the poet says that that's how love comes to be with us. That's how love chooses to be with us. Not in any way that tramples us down or leaves us bereft or impoverishes us or abuses us or empowers us to do any of that to anybody else, but a small visitation that seeps into our senses and dies itself into our hearts and into our lives and our actions. I'm still doing a lot of wondering about Jesus' list. I'm not a whole lot happier than I was about it 6 weeks ago, but a little bit. But I think most of my questions I'm left with don't have much to do with the grander scheme of things, and I'm willing to let them go. One thing that I am sure of is that to live in imitation of love means to care for the world, for the lost, for the wounded, for the trampled down, the defiled, ourselves and others. I hope that you also wonder about the list and what it might mean for your lives, and as you do, remember the love that is with you. Allow it to visit with you in the shared cup and bread today. Eat and drink together as a community that strives to be undefiled. Be dyed with the hue of grapes. Be dyed with the color of love and bear that out into the world around you. Amen.